although I was technically invited to speak on the pretext of my book, I am going to usurp authority, and I'm going to speak on the situation in Gaza, but always informed by the research that I undertook for the book. And then hopefully at the end, assuming you're still around, I want to talk about what practically we can do, because the situation begs for our involvement, participation, assistance, support, and that old-fashioned word, solidarity. The people in Gaza the past few weeks, they have been desperately seeking support and at the same time profoundly disappointed at how little support their actions have evoked. And sitting as I do in New York City, it's hard to find words to convey my profound disappointment at the lack of a reaction here to a desperate, possibly disastrous situation coming up in Gaza. That having been said, let me now talk about Gaza. I want to devote my remarks to trying to figure out what is this place and why are we at the situation we're presented with today. During the 1948 war, the commemoration of which will be in a few days, Israel expelled several 100,000 Palestinians into Gaza, and 70 years later, that is now, about 70% of Gaza's population comprises what are officially recognized as refugees, namely the expellees from 1948, and then the successive generations of those refugees that under the UN classification constitute, meaning the children, the grandchildren, and probably at this point even great-grandchildren, constitute refugees. So the first point you should bear in mind, place in your memory bank, is that 70% of the population consists of refugees. Secondly, 50% of the population, a little more, 51%, they're children. They're children under the age of 18. So, if I were to ask this young woman, how old are you?
34.
Oh, that's much older than I expected. This young man is 23. So if you subtract from this young man's age roughly 5 years, so if you look at his baby face, which no doubt breaks the heart of his significant other sitting next to him, but if you take his age and subtract 5 years, and then from that age down, that's the population of Gaza. It's over 50% children, or about 1 million people. And then this population of overwhelmingly refugees, predominantly children, this population is situated in among the most densely populated places on Earth. It's more densely populated even then Tokyo. So, the foundational level or layer is the refugee population. Then, roughly 50 years ago, a half century ago, the next level or layer set in. Gaza came under occupation. Israel in June 1967 occupied the Gaza Strip. Although the occupation began in 1967, that doesn't mean that Israel hadn't already committed significant atrocities in Gaza. Atrocities, by the way, now has a special resonance in the conflict, as Natalie Portman, in what I thought was a quite resonant statement, accused Israel of committing atrocities in Gaza. In any case, the first massive atrocities occurred in November 1956, when Israel, along with France and the UK, invaded Egypt, what was called the tripartite invasion. And in the course of the invasion, Israel occupied Gaza, and in Khan Yunis and Rafah, Israel killed several hundred unarmed civilians. The best documentation of those massacres comes not in the form of a scholarly tome, but from Joe Sacco, the very impressive cartoonist who produced a massive volume entitled Footnotes in Gaza, put out, my memory is, Metropolitan Books, and well worth looking at. After Israel occupied Gaza, almost immediately after, Israel's Ariel Sharon, he embarked on a fresh round of atrocities in Gaza in order to pacify the population during the years roughly 1969 to 71. Although Israel claims that in 2005 it ended the occupation of Gaza, the legal consensus, including by Israel's leading authority in international law, Yoram Dinstein, the legal consensus is Israel continues to be the occupying power in Gaza inasmuch as it controls the land, the sea, and air access to the enclave. Although under international law, occupations per se are not illegal, it's my opinion, which I devote some space to documenting in the book I wrote, it's my opinion that at this point in time, it's correct to refer not only to Israel's occupation of Gaza, but Israel's illegal occupation. Because the essence of an occupation under international law is that it's supposed to be temporary. If it's not temporary, then under international law, it technically constitutes an annexation. And such annexations are illegal under international law. So inasmuch as it's pretty obvious after a half century that Israel ain't going anywhere, then the reasonable inference is it no longer constitutes an occupation, which by definition is supposed to be temporary. It constitutes an annexation, which under international law is illegal. So we have the refugee status of the overwhelming majority of the population as a result of what happened 7 decades ago. The next layer, the occupation, which began to unfold 5 decades ago, and then roughly a little more than 1 decade ago, the refugee status compounded by the occupation was now compounded by another level, that is the blockade or siege of Gaza. Gaza had already been subjected to various forms of blockade, beginning in the early 1990s, 1991, the policy of what's called closure, in which Gazans weren't able any longer to freely travel to the West Bank and vice versa. But in January 2006, the people of Gaza committed a cardinal sin. There were what Jimmy Carter called completely honest and fair elections. I'm quoting Mr. Carter. But Gaza elected the wrong party into power. And that's not how free and fair elections are supposed to happen. You're supposed to elect who the United States and Israel want to be elected. And as a consequence of that grievous sin committed by the people of Gaza, Israel, quickly followed by the United States and the cowardly, perfidious European Union, slapped brutal sanctions on Gaza. And then these sanctions were then exacerbated in 2007 when Hamas, the legally elected government, committed a second sin, that being the United States, Israel, and elements of the Palestinian Authority orchestrated a coup against Hamas, and Hamas did not passively accept its fate as a dethroned government. It preempted the coup, and then the sanctions against Gaza were turned another notch. Those were pretty brutal sanctions. It was hard to find something the entry of which was not banned in Gaza. All sorts of condiments were banned. Chocolate was banned. Baby chicks were banned. Potato chips were banned, all on the pretext that they posed dire security threats. And one can only imagine the lethal potential were it the case that bonbons were allowed into Gaza. The consensus of international opinion is the blockade of Gaza is illegal, as it constitutes a form of collective punishment, and that, to quote Mary McGowan Davis, the New York State judge, who was the primary author of a report on Gaza and is by no means anything remotely approaching what one might call radical, Nonetheless, on this particular point, she properly concluded the report by saying that the blockade of Gaza must be lifted immediately and unconditionally. Immediately and unconditionally. The European Parliament a few weeks ago overwhelmingly called for, quote, an immediate and unconditional end to the blockade. Now, I would want to stress, so that you can be armed with the facts when you leave the room this evening, that the legal position, as enunciated by Mary McGowan Davis, the European Parliament, is the blockade has to be lifted unconditionally. It's not conditioned on Hamas disarming. It's not conditioned on Hamas ceasing to construct tunnels. There can be no conditions on the lifting of the blockade. The blockade is a form of collective punishment. It has to end immediately and unconditionally. That's the law. So now we have three layers: the refugees, then the occupation, then the blockade, and now we have a fourth layer, namely the massacres that Israel periodically visits on Gaza. In the past 15 years, let's see, that would bring us back to 2004. I'm trying to think of some event that everyone would remember from 2004. Anyone?
Re-election of Duggan.
Re-election of? Oh. I thought that was something we would all not want to remember. Can you think of something that will bring a little bit more cheer to the room? Stormy Daniels entered show business. Since 15 years ago, 2004, Israel has visited not one, not two, not three, not four, not five, not six, not seven. It's visited 8 massacres on Gaza. Let's not forget, overwhelmingly, a child population. 2004 Operation Rainbow, 2004 Operation Days of Penitence, 2006 Operation Summer Rains, 2006 Operation Autumn Clouds. It begins to sound like a Irving Berlin show. 2008 Operation Hot Winter, 2008-9 Operation Cast Lead, 2012 Operation Pillar of Defense, 2014 Operation Protective Edge. 8 massacres, 15 years. Who's on the receiving end? Who are the recipients? A majority. Gaza's 1 million children. It's hard to convey in numbers, in statistics, in ratios, in proportions, the magnitude of the devastation that's been visited on Gaza, an area already suffering from a brutal, merciless, illegal, inhuman blockade, a medieval blockade. I can go through the numbers, but somehow I don't think they convey the magnitude. So instead, I'm going to quote someone. There's a fellow named Peter Maurer, M-A-U-R-E-R. He's the head of the International Committee of the Red Cross. And as the head of the Red Cross, you can imagine his job description is basically, aside from his administrative responsibilities, his job description is to visit war zones. So, if you're an enterprising Google surfer and you go on Google and you enter Peter Maurer, Afghanistan, he's been there. Peter Maurer, Yemen, he's been there. Peter Maurer, Iraq, he's been there. Peter Maurer, Syria, he's been there. Peter Maurer, Central African Republic, he's been there. Maurer has been to every one of those war zones that we're all familiar with from the nightly news. And yet, and nonetheless, and notwithstanding, Maurer, when he left Gaza after Operation Protective Edge, he said, "I've never seen such massive destruction ever before. I've never seen such massive destruction ever before." He's been to Afghanistan, he's been to Yemen, he's been to Iraq, he's been to Syria, he's been to the Central African Republic. I've never seen such massive destruction ever before. Gaza, little Gaza, which could fit into this room, practically. Never seen such massive destruction ever before. Well, it will come as no surprise then. Refugees, occupation, blockade, periodic massive death and destruction. It'll come as no surprise then that beginning in 2012, the UN began to issue reports wondering, well, let's quote the first report, the title, "Will Gaza be a livable place in 2020? Can Gaza physically survive?" By 2015, UNCTAD, one of the UN agencies, it no longer used the interrogative, it used the declarative. It said, on its present trajectory, Gaza will be unlivable in 2020. Literally. Remember, for those of you who haven't read these reports, they are profoundly boring, tedious, very professional, very objective, devoid of adjectives, devoid of adverbs. These are UN bureaucrats. So when they say unlivable, that's not poetry. That's not hyperbole. That's literal. If they were to depart a jot from literal language, Israel and its apologists would go hysterical. So they're very professional, very careful. In fact, in 2017, a year ago, the UN revised its forecast again. It said, quote, the unlivability threshold has been passed quite a long time ago. The unlivability threshold has been passed quite a long time ago. For those of you, probably not in this room, but maybe some who will eventually listen on YouTube, some of you might think, well, you know, who can trust the UN? He's quoting UN agencies. But then, even Israel's chief of military intelligence, he said back in 2016 that the Gaza Strip, remember this is 2 years ago, the Gaza Strip has deteriorated to the point of facing a catastrophe. The Gaza Strip has deteriorated to the point of facing a catastrophe. 97% of Gaza's drinking water is unfit for human consumption. Unfit for human consumption. That should resonate with an American audience at any rate. It's not so long ago that there was a national outcry and indignation over Flint, Michigan, when it was found that the water supply was contaminated. But here it's not one city, it's the whole of Gaza. What does that mean practically? Well, I'd like to quote Sarah Roy at Harvard Center for Middle Eastern Studies, who's considered the leading academic authority on Gaza's economy. I will mention, though I'm averse to playing the Holocaust card, but Sarah's parents, both of them, were in Auschwitz, and she's a practicing Jew, not a Jew by fortune or whim of fate. She's a practicing Jew. Both of her parents were in Auschwitz, and she came out with a new edition recently of her standard work on Gaza's economy, and she has some additional chapters, introduction, conclusion, in the book. And she says at one point, and I'm quoting her now, innocent human beings, most of them young, are slowly being poisoned by the water they drink and likely by the soil in which they plant. Innocent human beings are being poisoned. Some of you in this room have children and grandchildren. Now imagine each morning facing the reality that you are unwittingly, of course, but as you feed your children, as you provide them with water before your eyes, you're poisoning them. Let's be clear. Let's not run, flee from the facts. Israel is poisoning 1 million children in Gaza. That's a fact. And I will say it 10,000 times. Israel is poisoning 1 million children in Gaza by imposing that blockade. Now, nobody likes to play the comparative suffering card. There's something unseemly about comparing suffering and trying to determine which is worse than the other. Israel and Jewish organizations for many years were emphatic that the Nazi Holocaust was unique and it was worse than any other destruction that has occurred in the course of human history. And then others chimed in to claim, no, mine was as bad, if not worse. And the American Jewish historian, Peter Novick, he called this the Holocaust sweepstakes, each trying to prove mine was worse. So I don't want to descend to that mode of argumentation. So let's just say the situation in Gaza is distinct. It's different. What makes it different from all the other horrendous situations in the world? Apparently not enough horrendous situations for that Dracula-like freak in Israel who is now rubbing his paws as he seeks to unleash another nightmare scenario in the Middle East. But to return, there is something different about Gaza. It was put this way by the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, the main humanitarian organization servicing the refugees, the Palestinian refugees in Gaza, but elsewhere in the Middle East too. They said as follows: when a place becomes unlivable, people move. This is the case for environmental disasters, such as droughts, or for conflicts, such as in Syria. Yet, this last resort, the ability to move, is denied to the people of Gaza. They cannot move beyond their 365 kilometers territory. They cannot escape. The media, they refer to the demarcation, the fence demarcating Gaza from Israel. They call it a border fence. They call it a border fence. The people of Gaza, beginning March 20th, set as their objective to breach the fence, caging them in. Israel alleges that it's just protecting its side of the border. But does this fence demarcate a border as if between two sovereign states? Confucius, he wrote once, "The beginning of wisdom is to call things by their proper name." I must confess that there was a period when I was teaching political theory, and then the orders came down from above that you can't just teach Western political theory, you have to incorporate other cultures. And I picked up Confucius, I started to read it, and I'm thinking, this is just the stuff you find in fortune cookies. How, pray tell, could I teach it? But then I discovered belatedly, when my teaching career came to an abrupt conclusion, my formal teaching career, I discovered, you know what, there's actually kind of there's a lot of wisdom, for example, in that saying. The beginning of wisdom is to call things by their proper name. So, let's try to apply it to the case at hand. Already back in 2003, and I want to stress 2003, which is before that infernal blockade was imposed on Gaza. That began in 2006 with the elections. Already back in 2003, the distinguished Hebrew University sociologist Baruch Kimmerling, he called Gaza the largest concentration camp ever to exist. The largest concentration camp ever to exist. The newspaper Haaretz, which is Israel's most respected, if not particularly popular newspaper, it refers to what it calls, quote, the Gaza ghetto, with the obvious resonances, if you are Jewish, of that other ghetto, the Warsaw ghetto. Even the conservative former British Prime Minister David Cameron, he called Gaza an open-air prison. The people of Gaza are attempting to break through not a border fence, but a concentration camp, if we're to believe Baruch Kimmerling. A ghetto, if we're to believe Haaretz. A prison gate, if we're to believe David Cameron. A concentration camp, a ghetto, a prison that's trapping the people of Gaza. And I want to stress, I am not using poetic language. I'm using the language of boring UN bureaucrats. They're trying to breach a concentration camp fence, a ghetto fence, a prison gate that's trapping them in an unlivable space. An unlivable space in which 2 million people, half of them children, are slowly being poisoned. Not my words. Sarah Roy. 2 million people, half of them children, slowly being poisoned. That brings us more or less to the present. I want to just look at one other aspect of the situation, and then we can talk. Namely, Gaza and the law. The human rights organizations in the current round have not been bad. When they're bad, I say so, and I devote about a quarter of the book I wrote to denouncing those organizations for their apologetics, their lies, their cowardice. In the current round, they haven't been bad. Human Rights Watch published a good report shortly after the beginning of the demonstrations. Amnesty has been quite good. However, I have to enter one qualification, one caveat. They accuse Israel of using disproportionate force. That's Amnesty. They accuse Israel of using excessive force. That's the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. But is this disproportionate force, excessive force, is this the point at issue? Except for the New York Times, the consensus has been that the demonstrations have been overwhelmingly nonviolent. Again, I have to stress, except for the New York Times, which, if you read its pages, you would think that the people of Gaza are about to impose another Holocaust on Israel. The demonstrations have been overwhelmingly nonviolent. Not a single Israeli has suffered an injury, not even a scratch. That's literally the case. Not even a scratch, not a single injury, let alone a mortal wound. On the Palestinian side, about 40 Palestinians have already been killed, including 4 children and several people clearly identified as the press. Over 5,000 have been injured, and the injuries are of a particularly and intentionally ghastly sort, which are creating what the human rights reports call life-changing injuries. Amputations, permanent, what we would call permanent injuries. The last demonstration, which again, to read the New York Times, you would have been terrified at the fate Israel was confronting. The Palestinian Center for Human Rights, it wrote an extensive document on what happened that last Friday. I don't have time, of course, to quote it at any great length, but they described it as, quote, fully peaceful, and our field workers did not witness weapons or armed persons. The point then is that Israel is resorting not to disproportionate force, not to excessive force, but overwhelmingly it is targeting an unarmed civilian population with lethal force, causing massive permanent injury and death. This is not about disproportionate or excessive force. This is targeting with lethal force a civilian population. It is a campaign of state terrorism designed not just to break Gaza's will to resist, but paradoxically, its goal is to goad, G-O-A-D, tempt, induce the people of Gaza to return to terrorism. That's its purpose. As one Israeli senior official said, we don't do Gandhi very well, which meant, and it's true, no, it's true. What they meant was, when you were faced with non-violent protesters, it's very hard for us to quell them. So, in order to free themselves from the burden of doing Gandhi, they target children, they target beloved journalists, hoping to so enrage the people of Gaza as they see the dead children on the ground who were shot in the head as they were fleeing the border fence. They're hoping, and frankly, it's a very rational hope, and it may happen, that the people of Gaza will abandon the nonviolence. Large numbers of them will give up in despair, and then there will be a portion who will go back to the old way. This is state terrorism. It's crimes against humanity. It's not disproportionate or excessive force. The human rights organizations, they strenuously avoid these incendiary legal conclusions. Instead, they use the antiseptic language of disproportionate and excessive force, knowing full well that most of the public, in the court of public opinion, people shrug off disproportionate and excessive force, thinking, rightly or wrongly, that that just comes with the turf, that wherever there's conflict, battles, resort to force, it's always going to be a little excessive and a little bit disproportionate. The one thing they won't say, because that's crossing a red line for the holy state, they won't say they're targeting unarmed civilians. They're targeting children. However, one of the curiosities of the human rights reports is that their descriptions of what happens are generally quite accurate. It's the legal conclusions that begin to divert from reality. Here are the facts. Here are the legal conclusions, supposedly based on the facts. But as you can see from my visual recreation, metaphorical of course, between the facts and the legal conclusions, there is this space. And that's where the lawyers step in, because they have to interpret the facts in order to find the legal conclusions. And as everyone in this room knows, especially if you are a lawyer, when the lawyers step in, the truth flees out or flies out. If that causes you pain and anguish, truth is a bitter pill to swallow. Yes, calling things by their right names, so it's the beginning of wisdom, so henceforth, instead of calling them lawyers, we will just say crooks. And you see what makes a generalization is it's generally true. People don't seem to understand that. It's the same thing with stereotypes. A stereotype is just a pejorative for a generalization. And stereotypes are stereotypes because they're generally true. That's why when we were coming with you two in the elevator today, I pointed out that I couldn't be late because I'm Jewish. Because Jews are never late. And this woman, at first she was outraged at my generalization, and then she proceeded to point out, I'm Jewish and you're right, I'm never late. And so you have this kind of irony, even in Amnesty's latest report on Gaza, which was really quite excellent. if we keep aside the legal conclusions, it begins on this note. This is the first sentence. Israel is carrying out a murderous assault against protesting Palestinians, with its armed forces killing and maiming demonstrators who pose no imminent threat to them. Not bad. Israel's carrying out a murderous assault against protesting Palestinians, with its armed forces killing and maiming demonstrators who pose no imminent threat to them. Well, if it's a murderous assault, it's not disproportionate force. A murderous assault is something very different. It's a crime against humanity. You're targeting civilians. You're killing them. For it to be disproportionate, you have to demonstrate some kind of military objective or target. There is none. They're unarmed. However, I would want to add, because this is a question of the law, speaking as not a lawyer, but I know it reasonably well, even if Gazans did use violent force, the law is, it's not me speaking, it's the law. Israel would still not have the right to use any force, not even proportionate or moderate force, against them. The law is straightforward. A people struggling for self-determination or to end an alien occupation under international law, they are not debarred from using violent force to achieve their freedom. They have the right, under the law, to use armed force to achieve their freedom. That same international law says an occupying power or a colonial power is prohibited from using any violent force to sustain the status quo. They have the right to use force. They are not exercising that right now. They're engaging in nonviolent mass resistance, but they have the right. Now, when those human rights organizations say Israel is using disproportionate force, the implication is they have the right to use proportionate force. When those human rights organizations say Israel is using excessive force, the implication is they have the right to use moderate force. That is a flat-out falsehood. It's a corruption of international law. They have no right to use any force so long as they're carrying out an occupation and imposing a denial of self-determination to the people of Gaza. Now, that may all sound technical to people in this room, and I'll even admit that. So let's try to cast the question in its simplest form, but one which doesn't in the least, not a jot, not an iota, distort the basic facts. The people of Gaza are not just struggling to end an occupation. They're not just struggling to achieve self-determination. They are struggling for literally their bare physical survival. The one and only pertinent moral legal question boils down to this: does Israel have the right to poison 1 million children? Does Israel have the right to poison 1 million children? If not, then they don't have the right to use proportionate force, moderate force, any force to encage the people of Gaza in an unlivable space where they're daily, incrementally, protractedly being poisoned. In the face of this abomination, all the legal niceties, technicalities that lawyers love to debate are completely beside the point. Thank you.
My question is, I very much appreciate how you spoke of much history here tonight. Many people always think that history is not relevant. How do you, in your framework, understand the wanton destruction of the greenhouses that the Israelis left behind, the wanton destruction of these economic engines by Gazans?
After Israel redeployed its army from within Gaza to its periphery, some greenhouses were destroyed. You know, I've read many things about that. To be perfectly honest, there are a few topics that interest me less than that. Maybe watching grass grow and paint dry. How you can describe them as economic engines when the whole of Gazan society for 50 years has been, as Sarah Roy describes it, systematically de-developed and destroyed, is simply beyond my comprehension. You think 3 greenhouses in Gaza are going to turn the tide? I don't know, it's like calling a community garden in Prospect Park as an economic engine in New York. It's just strange. I doubt you even believe it. Next question.
Okay, I have a couple of comments and then I have a question. Mm-hmm. One comment is, when you defend generalizations, you're also risking defending people who just blanket accuse Jews of Zionist crimes. And I'm fighting that all the time, and so are many people. And as for lawyers, what about those 2 members of the Center for Constitutional Rights who were denied access? You have some very, very idealistic lawyers. Okay, that being said, my question to you is, we ignore the Rwandan genocide, which was an actual factual genocide, and the world, these UN bodies can make all the legal pronouncements they want, and you can insist on that, and we can agree with you, but it doesn't seem to move anything. There's nothing to enforce these laws or the judgments that you cited this New York judge. It's great to have these judgments, but who enforces it?
Well,
what do we do?
That's always a problem with the law. So if you take our own country, in 1954, the Supreme Court rendered the decision Brown versus Board of Education, which famously said that separate is not equal, and called for desegregation. That was 1954. 10 years later, in 1964, only 1% of African Americans going to school in the South were attending desegregated or integrated schools. That's correct what you say. The only thing that integrated schools in the South was a mass movement that forced the federal government to act on and implement the law. Now, that opportunity has, so to speak, been availed of us by the people of Gaza, who, in that same spirit that animated the American South during the Civil Rights Movement, have embarked on the route of nonviolent civil resistance to, as they make very plain, to implement the law. In their case, two aspects of the law: the right of return of refugees and ending the illegal blockade of Gaza. However, just as in our own American South, you can't do it on your own. The forces arrayed against African Americans in our society and against the people in Gaza are just too overwhelming and formidable. And so the African Americans in the South needed and called upon support from white Northerners and then ultimately the federal government. And now, one of the biggest tragedies of what's currently unfolding over there is that whereas they're making incredible sacrifices and have basically made a pact with death, because they said, come May 15th, we're breaking out. And it's a great tragedy, a really profound human tragedy, that in that moment of truth, the international solidarity movement with the Palestinians is nowhere to be seen. I haven't seen one demonstration in New York except for the progressive Jewish group, If Not Now. I've not seen anything. It's actually bewildering that when Palestinians have finally again taken their fate into their hands, there's nothing. Today I received an email from a Gazan. He wrote me, I think by now the participants and organizers of the march are drowning into deeper despair and losing hope in the protest. Hamas leaders think that nothing they do matters anymore, that nobody cares, and nothing could change the current situation. Aside from Bernie Sanders, actions in support of the march are unheard of, if not non-existent. You might have seen how last Friday, less people have joined the ranks of peaceful protesters, and more people joined the groups that are trying to break out of the siege and blockade by setting tires on fire, throwing stones, or breaking through the fence. Having said that, Hamas is keen to keep the protest going even after May 15th, because the alternative scenario of bringing the march to an end means going to war with Israel, to break out of the blockade at all costs. Or, as you said it in our conversation, half of the masses will fall back into depression and despair, and the other half will resort to violence and rock throwing. I don't have much expectation on this Friday, meaning tomorrow, but May 15th will surely be unique. I have to ask the question, where will we be May 15th? What happened? I don't get it. All these people chanting as if it were an incantation, BDS, 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 BDS. As if they were taking a narcotic. And now the moment arises. The people there are begging for support, looking for anything, anywhere. And there's nothing. I don't get it. I don't understand what happened. There are 1,000 explanations. Trump, other causes, this and that. But at the end of the day, they're really pitiful excuses. You have a question?
I've been asked by people around me about the justification for the violence.
What violence?
I mean, from Israel's side.
Oh. Mm-hmm.
And I know that in Israel, a lot of this, a lot of soldiers have got a good education level. There must be some way that they use to convince them to use that amount of force.
Well, there's no contradiction between being educated and being a monster.
Justification that they use. I mean,
well, the justification, it's not justification. There is a, as the expression has it, there is a method in the madness. And it's a kind of win-win situation for the Israelis, unfortunately. Part of the reason is because Israelis are firmly of the opinion that Arabs only understand the language of force. So in order to put these uppity Palestinians in their place, they got this crazy idea that they have the right to end the siege, that we'll just take out the big club, or in this case, brutally lethal weaponry, and we'll just kill them until they stop. But the other side is, even if they don't stop, if you keep killing them at this rate, at some point they're going to resort back to violence. And that's what Israel wants anyway. That's what Israel wants. It wants them to go back to the old ways because they don't do Gandhi well. So it's not as if it's devoid of reason. It's murderous, criminal, but there's a plan.
Right, it's just that people are afraid of Israel. And also...
Who's afraid of Israel?
I think most people, right? I mean, they're a terrorist state.
But I mean, when you say they, who are you referring to at that moment?
Why anyone is afraid to stand up to.
No, I don't think that's a credible explanation. We don't live in a perfectly democratic society, but we have the capacity to demonstrate, to go on vigils, sit-ins, hunger strikes. Well, Israel's not going to fire, well, not yet, is not going to nuke us again. We always have to enter the caveat, not yet, given who's their head of state.
Okay, I guess I was thinking more like governments or like armies going in. But I think the reason that their soldiers do it is just because why soldiers do. I mean, you're required to be part of the army there, and I've talked to people who were part of the Israeli army, and even if they were pacifist, but for some reason became part of the army, even coming from other countries to fulfill their 2 years, they just did what they were told.
You know what? And they also do what they do want to do. It's not just orders. It's a morally very depraved society at this point. There's a lot of delight. There is a lot of delight that is expressed at killing Palestinians. All you had to see was, a few weeks ago, the video as the soldiers cheered when they killed a Palestinian through their telescopic lens.
The Tel Aviv demonstrations kill the Arabs.
Yeah,
Demonstration.
and during the wars, when they set up like movie theater seats to watch the killing, the destruction in Gaza. No, it's a very depraved place. Now, I'm not trying to score points by dumping on Israel. It dumps on itself enough for everybody. But I don't want to make excuses. I'm not going to pretend it's not so bad. No, that place has really gone over the cliff. It's the only country in the world where the majority of the population supports Trump. It's not just the leader of the population. Yeah, the public opinion polls show a majority of Israelis support Trump. Jewish. Well, I don't know if the polls include. Sometimes they sometimes do Jewish-only polls and sometimes Israeli polls, and sometimes they break it down even as they do the whole thing. But it's look, we're facing a very ominous moment now, and it's not just about Gaza. It's a very ominous moment. Whatever you think of Syed Nasrallah, the head of the Hezbollah, one thing he is not, and everybody will agree, he is not a windbag. He's not he doesn't just shoot the breeze. And he's made statements in the past couple of days which seem to indicate that a war is on its way between Israel, the United States, and Saudi on one side, and Iran, and Iran's allies on the other. Now, in the face of the fact, whatever you think about Iran's nuclear weapons program, and its right, and whatever else, there's no dispute whatsoever that Iran has been honoring the agreement. Now, we have reached a point with that loudmouth, obnoxious, racist, Jewish supremacist vampire who heads the state of Israel, that he's now egging on the maniac in our White House to go to war in Iran because they're honoring the agreement. And of course, the Saudi parasites support it because they dread the prospect that one day, in the distant future, they may have to get up in the morning and go to work. And like Maynard G. Krebs, for those of you who remember the Dobie Gillis show, whenever Dobie's father would say, "Maynard, when are you going to work?" Maynard would go, "Work, work." And that's the Saudis. Work, work. When MBS was asked, "Where did you get the money to buy that $400 million yacht and that $400 million painting and that $300 million home in France?" He said, That's a personal question. You shouldn't be asking me. So, dreading as those Saudi parasites do, the prospect of work, they, along with the Israelis, are urging the Americans, who are not all that not eager, to launch something which, I'll have to say it, it's kind of scary. Iran is not Iraq. It is not a walkover, and as we all know, Iraq turned out not to be a walkover, or as they said, it was going to be a cakewalk. Well, not quite. But you have to sort of catch your breath. In the case of Iraq, they claimed, falsely as we all know, that there were weapons of mass destruction. In the case of Iran, it's being targeted even as everyone says it's honoring the agreement.
And they don't have a nuclear weapons program.
Well, there are some claims that they had one up until 2003. I happen to think the claims are dubious, but it's beside the point. It's beside the point.
Look at Bolton.
You can mention all of them. So, no, that society is crazy. Doesn't mean it's locked into the genes. Crazy societies have reformed themselves, as Germany and Japan did in quite impressive and in exemplary ways after World War II. But let's not in any way extenuate or minimize the lunacy that's afoot in that state. And that, look, our country's not great, but I'm still going to make a distinction. Netanyahu's been in office for 10 years. Trump, it's been 2 years. He did lose the popular vote. And we're not where Israel's at. No, that place is over the cliff. And I have to say, it's a very interesting sight to behold. What will American Jews do as they see the head of state of the Jewish state now egging on a war openly in a kind of really sick, braggadocio sort of way? If that war goes awry, it's not as there's a famous cartoon in the New Yorker. There's a TV set, the screen, and you see this huge mushroom cloud. And there's an old Jewish couple watching the screen, and the caption reads, "So, is it good for the Jews?" And I think what Netanyahu is doing now is really not good for Jews. Openly pushing for what quite probably, not even possibly, will be a cataclysm of world historic magnitude. Not smart. No. It's a very problematic moment we're at now.
Well, like all right-wingers, he could be propping himself up politically, and who cares about the future? I mean, that's what dictators.
Yeah, I wouldn't put it past him. However, we're at a difficult moment right now because Trump too has his domestic issues. And what do politicians do typically to distract attention and to whip up a hysteria supporting them while they launch wars? And so there's going to be a very big temptation now by Trump to find a pretext to distract from his domestic travails by launching a war. And then that's compounded by the fact that the Israelis are very upset by the marches in Gaza, especially as they come on Israel's 70th anniversary. And so there's a very big temptation on the part of Trump to commit a large-scale massacre as attention is diverted to the Iran theater of events, while the cameras are riveted on Iran on May 12th, when Trump will or will not renew the agreement. That obnoxious, loudmouth, racist, Jewish supremacist vampire in Israel may exploit the occasion to commit a large-scale bloodbath in Gaza. I think there is.
For the next question, please.
I didn't ask a question yet. Egypt, what about Egypt?
I would say at this particular moment, Egypt is a bit player. The economy is in shambles, and Egypt can only hope and pray for subsidies from the United States and from the South, from the Gulf countries. It's an irrelevancy. The key players now are clearly the Saudis, Israel, and the United States on one hand, and Iran and its what's called its Shia allies in the Arab world.
Good evening, I'm a big fan of yours. I wanted to say that was an excellent portrayal of how critical the situation is in Gaza. Since there was so much spoken negativity in the speech, I was wondering, is there any glimmer of hope for Gaza, and what can people do to change the tide? And what can Gazans do so that the violations of global law are actually enforced?
Gazans are doing everything they can. They're giving their all. You can't ask more from them at this point. They're going out and they're getting themselves killed. You can't ask for more. The problem is here. There are things we could do. I'm starting up, or we are starting up a campaign. It's very simple. Doesn't require huge amounts of energy. It's just called #MeToo, I support Gaza. It's going to be a website, and we're going to try to solicit famous people and not famous people just to deliver half-minute or 1-minute statements in support of Gaza. All you have to do is send a video, or we'll Skype it and we'll record it. Very simple. Hopefully we'll get the website up by the weekend. If you'd like to join that campaign, all it's going to ask you to do is ask your friends, ask your family, ask anyone you know who's famous, semi-famous, infamous, notorious, even a serial killer or two, if you know them, to record a half-minute in support of Gaza. We'll have a nice website, a little picture of each person. You click the picture, you'll get the statement. Or you just go to my website and email me, and then I will put you on the list. It's just my name, very easy, normanfinkelstein.com. Hit the contact, and we hope to be up and running this weekend.
One more question here.
Okay.
Hi, I'm just wondering, since Gazans are getting closer and closer to the crossing over, what we should be saying to people when, Israelis in particular, when they're saying, well, but what are we supposed to be doing, the whole security argument?
Well, the answer is very simple. End the blockade, it's illegal. End the blockade, it's illegal. And to just say simply, you ask the person, does Israel have the right to use force when the people of Gaza are being poisoned? I don't think they have that right.